It was an ordinary evening, or at least it seemed that way at the start. I was sitting in my room, absorbed in my phone, the light from the screen illuminating my face when I heard a quiet knock on my door. It wasn't urgent or loud, just out of the ordinary. It was late, probably around midnight, and the house was mostly still. At first, I thought I had imagined it, so I ignored it. But then it came again. 3 soft taps, followed by the sound of the door creaking open. I looked up and saw her, my stepmom. Now, before I continue, let me explain a bit. My stepmom had always been polite and kind, but we weren't especially close. She wasn't the type to hang out in my room or have long, serious conversations. So, when I saw her standing there in the doorway with an odd, almost uncertain expression, I immediately sensed something was off. It was clear she wanted to talk about something important. "Can I come in?" she asked softly. I nodded, still confused, as she made her way to the edge of my bed and sat down carefully, almost as if she wasn't sure it was okay. By now, my heart was starting to race. There was something about late-night conversations that made everything feel more intense. Like every word carried extra significance. I tried to remain calm. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She paused for a moment, long enough to make me anxious, and then she met my eyes with a serious, unreadable look. "I need to ask you something," she said, her voice soft but firm. And suddenly, the atmosphere in the room shifted. I watched her closely, my mind racing with questions. What could she want at this hour? Was I in trouble? Had something happened to my dad? The silence stretched on before she finally spoke, and what she said left me in shock. It was something so unexpected that I struggled to make sense of it. I blinked, wondering if I had misunderstood, or if I was just dreaming. But she was dead serious. In that moment, I realized my night was about to take a very strange turn. I was stunned, sitting there staring at her, trying to process her words. I wanted to ask her to repeat it, just to make sure I hadn't misheard. But the way she looked at me, so serious and expectant, told me she wasn't joking. Whatever was happening, she meant it. I swallowed hard and managed to speak, my voice trembling slightly. "Wait, what? Why are you asking me that?" I sounded more confused than I intended. She sighed and looked down at her hands, which were nervously twisting in her lap. I don't know who else to talk to about this," she said quietly, her words slow and careful, as if she was testing how much to reveal. "I thought maybe you'd understand." "Understand? Understand what?" My mind was racing, trying to piece together what she was getting at. I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Confusion, nerves, and maybe even a little irritation. This was my stepmom, someone I barely spoke to beyond the usual greetings. She was nice, sure, but we weren't close. Now, here she was, sitting on my bed in the middle of the night, acting like I was the only person who could help her. "Okay," I said cautiously, still trying to keep my composure. "But what's really going on here? Did something happen?" She looked at me, her eyes searching mine, and for a moment I thought she might start crying. Instead, she just said, "It's hard to explain." Her voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. "But it's been bothering me for a while, and I need answers." Answers. I was completely lost. My room suddenly felt smaller. The walls seemed to close in, and the silence between us grew heavier. What could she need answers about? Why was she coming to me for them? Does Dad know about this? I asked, the only thing I could think to say. She quickly shook her head. No, she replied firmly. And I need you to promise me you won't tell him. Not yet. Yet? The word hit me like a punch. My dad was the calm, steady one in the family. Always the first person you'd turn to if something went wrong. So why was she keeping this from him? Why did she think I was the one to confide in? I felt a knot form in my stomach. Whatever she was hiding wasn't something small. It was something big. Something that had her sneaking into my room at midnight to talk about it. For the first time, I realized that whatever she was about to tell me could change everything. The air felt colder now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My stepmom looked like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. For a split second, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I realized I still had no idea what was going on. I don't know what you think I can do, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But you're freaking me out here. Just tell me what's going on. She hesitated again, biting her lip, as though she wasn't sure if she should continue. It's not something I can talk to just anyone about, she said finally. But I think you've noticed it too. That threw me off. Noticed what? I blinked, my heart racing as memories flooded back. Strange things had been happening. Noises late at night, things going missing, and then reappearing in odd places, the way my stepmom had been acting a little off these past few weeks. At the time, I'd brushed it off, thinking I was imagining things or just not paying attention. But now, sitting here with her, it was clear something was wrong. What do you mean? I asked quietly. What did I notice? She looked at me carefully, as if trying to gauge how much to reveal. You've heard the noises, haven't you? Her eyes locked onto mine, and my heart skipped a beat. Late at night, I wanted to deny it, but I couldn't. Yeah, I admitted, trying to sound casual. Houses make noises sometimes. It's probably nothing, but she shook her head. It's not nothing. I felt it. Someone's watching me. Her voice trembled, and for the first time, I saw how terrified she really was. It's like there's something in this house that doesn't belong here. My throat went dry. I didn't know what to say. This was getting way too strange, and part of me wanted to tell her to stop. But at the same time, I needed to hear more. What are you saying? I whispered. She looked at me again, her fear evident. I think we're not alone here, she said. And I think it knows we're starting to notice. I froze. My mind was spinning, and the chill that ran down my spine couldn't be ignored. Her words hung heavily in the air. We're not alone here. I wanted to laugh it off, tell her she was just being paranoid, but the fear in her eyes made it impossible. A strange unease spread through my chest, and for the first time, I truly considered the things I had once dismissed. Creaking in the hall when no one was there. Doors that felt stuck, like someone was holding them. Shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. Before, I'd always found an explanation, telling myself it was nothing because the alternative was too unsettling. But now, sitting there in the dark with my stepmom, I couldn't ignore it any longer. Why are you telling me this? I asked, my voice barely steady. What am I supposed to do about it? She looked down at her hands again, wringing them tightly. Because you're the only one I can talk to. Your dad won't believe me. He'll say I'm imagining things. She paused, then added, but you're not like him. You notice things. Her words sent a chill through me. and I couldn't help but glance toward the open door. The hallway beyond looked darker than usual, the shadows deeper. I pulled my knees up to my chest, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread. "Have you seen anything?" I asked softly, almost not wanting to know the answer. She hesitated, then nodded once. "Just a glimpse. Something standing at the end of the hallway near the stairs." It was late, and when I turned on the light, it was gone. My stomach dropped. That hallway, the one right outside my room, was where I'd heard those noises before. My pulse quickened. "Did it look like a person?" I asked. Her expression darkened and her voice trembled. "I don't know. It didn't feel like a person." The room fell into an oppressive silence, the kind where every sound felt magnified. I could hear my own heartbeat thumping in my ears, and suddenly I became acutely aware of the space around me, as if something might be watching from the dark corners. "Maybe we're just imagining it," I said quickly, desperate to break the tension. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. Neither did she. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned her head toward the open door, her eyes widening in terror. That's when I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the hallway. The sound echoed, unmistakable, and my stepmom froze, her eyes locked on the door, wide with fear. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. The footsteps were unmistakable. Someone or something was moving just outside my room. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead as the steps grew louder, closer, coming toward us. I turned to my stepmom, my mouth going dry. But she didn't look at me. Her eyes were fixed on the door, her face pale and rigid. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, barely audible. She nodded, her lips trembling, then softly whispered back, "It's happening again. We're not safe here." My stomach twisted as my breathing became faster. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt paralyzed. The steps stopped just outside the door, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. The room felt tighter, darker, suffocating. I glanced at my stepmom, her face frozen in terror. She was biting her lip so hard that I could see the tension in her jaw. Then, without warning, the door handle rattled. Just once, sharp and sudden. I froze, staring at it, willing it to stay still. But it moved. The door creaked open, and a shadow filled the doorway. I jumped back, my heart in my throat, as a figure stepped into the room. It wasn't a person, not in the way I had expected. The figure was tall and dark, almost as though it were made of shadow itself. The edges blurred, shifting like it didn't quite belong to this world. It seemed to stretch, grow, and then shrink, as if it were constantly changing shape. My breath caught in my throat, and my mind screamed for me to run. But my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, trapped by the darkness that had taken over the room. I glanced at my stepmom, who was now trembling, her hand covering her mouth. "Don't look at it," she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible. I couldn't help it. My eyes were locked onto the figure in the doorway, and despite my fear, there was something pulling me toward it. I needed to understand it. I needed to know what it was. The figure shifted again, warping as it moved forward. For a split second, I thought I saw something human. A face, or at least the faint outline of one, staring back at me. But it wasn't right. The eyes were dark, empty. as though they could pierce through me into my very soul. Suddenly, the air around us grew thick, heavy, as if it were harder to breathe. I coughed, trying to clear the strange pressure in my chest, but it only grew more intense. I looked at my stepmom again. Her eyes were wide with terror. "It's here," she gasped, her voice shaky. "It knows we're onto it." I didn't understand what she meant, but the fear in her eyes made something click in my mind. This wasn't just some random event. Whatever this thing was, it had been in the house for a long time, watching, waiting. Then, as if the air itself was trembling, the figure took another step forward, its shape becoming clearer, more defined. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Every part of me screamed to run, but I was frozen in place. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The room was silent again, except for the sound of my racing heartbeat. I stared at the empty doorway, still expecting it to return, but it didn't. Did you see that?" I whispered. My stepmom didn't answer right away. She was staring at the door, her face pale, shaking her head slowly. "It's not gone," she whispered. "It's still here, and it knows who we are." The air felt thick with dread. The tension was suffocating, and I could feel something heavy in the pit of my stomach. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't done with us. The silence was unbearable, and my breath came in shallow gasps. My eyes were glued to the doorway, waiting, expecting the dark figure to return. But it didn't. The tension in the room was overwhelming. Every creak in the house felt like an omen. I looked at my stepmom, who seemed just as frozen as I was, her eyes darting nervously between the door and me. "It's not gone," she whispered again, her voice trembling. "It's waiting. We have to leave." I nodded, my heart pounding. I knew she was right. We couldn't stay here, but the thought of moving was paralyzing. Leaving my room, walking into that hallway again. What if the thing was still out there, waiting for us to make a move? I slowly stood up, my legs shaky, and reached for the door. The moment my hand touched the handle, a rush of cold air hit me, and I heard it. Whispers, soft and chilling, sending a shiver down my spine. It was like someone was murmuring my name. I turned to my stepmom, but she wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were fixed on something behind me. "Don't," she whispered. "Whatever you do, don't look behind you." My blood ran cold. My body screamed at me to turn around, to see what she was so terrified of. But I couldn't. I forced myself to stay still, gripping the door handle tightly. Then it happened. A low guttural laugh filled the room, deep, unnatural, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. My stepmom gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in shock. I turned slowly, my heart racing, and there, standing right behind me, was the figure. It was taller now, its shape more defined, more menacing. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. I could see the outlines of its face, or at least what was left of it. The eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to draw me in. And its mouth, it was twisted, stretched wide in a grin that no human could ever make. My stepmom's voice broke through my daze. "We have to leave now," she screamed, grabbing my arm. I didn't need any more convincing. We bolted for the door, but as soon as I reached it, it slammed shut with a deafening thud. Panic surged through me as I pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The thing behind me let out another laugh, louder and closer, and then, in an instant, the room plunged into darkness. I screamed, my voice swallowed by the pitch black. My stepmom's hand was still on my arm, but I couldn't see anything. The only sound was that laugh, growing louder, closer, until it felt like it was inside my head. Just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the light flickered on, blinding me for a moment. I blinked, trying to adjust, and then it was gone. The figure, the darkness, everything vanished. The door swung open easily, and I stumbled out, gasping for air. But the hallway was empty. No shadow, no figure, just a quiet, empty house. I turned to my stepmom, still gripping my arm. What just happened? I gasped. She was shaking her head, her face as pale as a ghost. We shouldn't have tried to face it. I didn't understand. Face it? What do you mean? She looked at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear, regret. It was never supposed to leave the attic, she whispered. Her voice barely audible. My heart stopped. The attic. That's where it had been all along. And now it was free. Before I could speak, I heard it. A soft scratching noise from above. The attic door creaked open on its own. And I realized with sickening certainty that it was just getting started. The scratching noise from above grew louder, sharper, and I knew with growing dread that whatever had been hiding in the attic was coming down. My stepmom's grip tightened on my arm, and her face twisted in panic. "It's too late," she whispered. "It's already free." I could barely breathe. The thought of facing that thing again, after everything we had just been through, was terrifying. But something inside me snapped. We couldn't let it win. We couldn't let it take over our lives. "Where's your dad?" I asked, still struggling to catch my breath. She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze flickered towards the attic door, which was beginning to tremble as if something inside was pushing against it. "He's at work," she said finally, her voice shaking. "But it's not him that's the problem. It's the house, the curse. Whatever it is, it's tied to this place." I took a deep breath, gathering whatever courage I had left. "Then we need to finish this now." My stepmom nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "We need to go to the attic. That's where it started." Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this house as possible. But the thought of leaving behind everything, my family, the house, didn't sit right. We couldn't run forever. If we didn't stop it now, it would only grow stronger.